Well, first, thank you so much for coming out and being willing to sit a little more closely than you normally do. I know maybe you're a little uncomfortable. It's just a great chance to make new friends today. So thank you for that. This has been a fun week. We got to participate in a Good Friday service with some other churches on Friday evening. And then yesterday, we did a community event called the Flapjack Give Back at Oddfellows, and we handed out, I don't know how many hundreds of pancakes, but a lot of pancakes. I think Sarah said 70 or more people came. Yeah, and part of that was just a way to love on our community, and a lot of it was sponsored by a group called Thrive It that helped pay for the pancakes, and they gave us free T-shirts too. So if you want a T-shirt, they're right behind. They're on the counter over there by the bagels. Come to the common place, you get bagels, coffee, and T-shirts today. And so feel free to say, if you don't even have to have participated or even ate a pancake, just take a T-shirt. We want to get rid of those. And sizes are limited. Oh, there's 20. Okay, first come, first serve. All right. Just a couple of things. If you need to use the restroom, we got them down the hallway. You're free to do that. We've got coffee over there if you need some coffee, and there's more being brewed in the back. We're going to be taking up a communion at the end of the service, and so we'll just hand those elements out as part of the service. You don't have to go anywhere. We'll bring them right to you. All right. It's been an interesting year for the Commonplace. About a year ago, some of you guys know dear friends of ours, the Lombards. Dave was the manager of the coffee shop and also an elder in the church, and Bobby was the children's ministry coordinator, his wife, and they were just a dynamic couple. They loved this church, they were important parts of it, and they had to move away to go take care of an aging mother in Missouri. And so we missed them a lot. But when they told me, I understood, and I kind of braced myself. It was time for a new beginning, and we were able to hire. A lot of you stepped up in new ministry positions as a result of that, and the church continued to grow. It was tough, but there's kind of a sense of anticipation in that. And then we hired a new coffee shop manager, and about, a few months ago, Cheyenne came and told me, you know what, I really feel like I need to pursue my master's degree in fish management, whatever that is, and coffee didn't fit into that in some way, and so we said goodbye to her, and now I'm like, I just found a replacement, now I gotta find somebody else. Now I'm a little irritated, sometimes transition can be exciting, sometimes it can be a little bit irritating, and then I think it was like the same week, Sam called me into my own office. If you ever get called into your own office, it's just that, all right? Just brace yourself, it's never like good news. And he told me that he and his family were thinking about pursuing ministry in Tennessee. Lots of people apparently need help in Tennessee, and so they're going to go, and that's where God has led them, so they'll be moving out at the end of the month. And now I just want to cry. So you go from kind of anticipation to irritation to just, somebody else. And then I think just the last blow is so many of you know and love our good friends James and Mary, who are going to be starting raising cows, and apparently you can't do that around here. You got to go to Mifflintown or Berg or someplace. And so sometime in the fall they'll be transitioning it, and now I'm just angry. All right, I've moved through all of the seasons of grief in this time, and here's the miraculous thing: in the middle of all of this loss, all right, and I recognize that for me as the pastor, I probably internalize this more than most of you. God has continued to bless our church. It continues to grow. More and more people are coming, and I'm so grateful for that. And new leaders, like I said, are stepping up, and it's a good time for us. It's been a really neat season, but it still hurts a lot. And so as I was kind of wrestling through, what do I preach on Easter? It's the Super Bowl Sundays for pastors. It's like the big one. Don't mess up. You can mess up a lot of Sundays. Don't mess up Easter. And so what does God want me to preach on? And sometimes you come to Easter and you're like, how do I say the same thing but a little bit differently? And that's not necessarily what God calls us to do. But he did take me to a passage that I've never preached on that I know of before that happened on Resurrection Sunday. And it's a story of loss, but also a story of new beginning and of calling as well, and it brought encouragement to me. So whether or not you learned anything, at least it made me feel better. So I do hope that this blesses you, and this, I'm confident that while these have been specific things for our church and for me personally, a lot of you in this past year have gone through a season of loss as well. It could be loss of a job or an opportunity or a dream, whatever it might be. And the resurrection of Jesus speaks directly to our losses. And that's what we want to talk about today. Speaking of loss, have you ever lost your kid in the store? It's terrifying, right? 1 minute they're there, the next minute they're gone, and you just look at it. Maybe you remember being the kid lost in the store. You're convinced that your parents just took off and left you there. There's a story that's a little bit like this in the Bible that ties in. I've never preached on this story and Easter at the same time, but they're linked in a beautiful way. So you guys may remember that when Jesus was 12 years old, his parents every year would make a big trip to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. The Passover was a week-long feast to celebrate Israel's deliverance from slavery. And Mary and Joseph and Jesus and his brothers and sisters would go on this trip every year to go celebrate Passover. And one year when Jesus is 12, his mom and dad are on the way home, and about a day in, they realize that Jesus isn't with them. He's not with their friends. He's just missing, right? They lost him in the toy aisle. They don't know where he is. And so they're grieved, they're distressed, they turn around and they go back to Jerusalem, and 3 days later they find him. That's important, remember that. 3 days to find Jesus. And when they find him in the temple, he's sitting with all of these priests and rabbis and discussing theological things with them. And his mother's rightfully irritated with him and says, Jesus, didn't you know, like, me and your dad have been worried about you? And he says something interesting. He looks at her and he says, didn't you know that I had to be, I must be, it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house. Mom and Dad, you thought you lost me, but really I was discovering my calling in this. And this seems to be the first place in Scripture that Jesus is self-aware of his deity and who he is. And then it also opens the narrative then for his ministry. So that's the end of chapter 2 of Luke. Chapter 3, he's baptized and subsequently begins preaching. And today, we're going to read an account that happens 21 years later, possibly to the very day of that moment, when Jesus' parents were distressed because they couldn't find him. They go back to Jerusalem. They find him in the temple. And in the beginning of Luke 24, which is where we're going to be, you can turn in your Bibles there, or we will put the verses on the screen. But in the beginning of Luke 24, the story that you're also familiar with is that the women in Jesus' entourage, they go to the tomb to bring some burial spices to remember his death. And when they get there, Jesus is gone, right? The stone in front of the tomb is rolled away. He's not there any longer. They're confused. An angel shows up and tells them that Jesus is alive. They run back and tell the disciples, and the disciples don't believe them. In fact, it says the disciples thought that they were an idle tale. The ladies, suffering from post-traumatic stress, whatever it might be, they concocted this story. It couldn't really be true. And then we get to verse 13, where we read about a story called The Road to Emmaus. And on this story, it involves two people, one guy named Cleopas and his partner, who many theologians believe to be his wife, possibly one of the Marys that served with Jesus. And so in this story, it opens up with two people, possibly a husband and wife, leaving Jerusalem, just like Jesus' own parents had 21 years before, distressed because they couldn't find Jesus. He's nowhere to be found. And so we'll start reading in verse 13. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. So, just to kind of stop right there real quickly. Again, these two, we don't know if they followed. It seems as though they probably were in Jesus' group when he went into Jerusalem the beginning of the week, during that triumphal entry. They had been, in Jesus' group at that moment to go celebrate Passover. They had some really big hopes for Jesus. They wanted him to become the king, to overthrow the government, and to set up his earthly kingdom. And so they also had gone to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was like the epicenter for this big festival. this big party that happened for the Jewish people every year. And imagine if there was a thing, an event in your history that marked your nation being freed from slavery for 400 years, you would celebrate that. I can't imagine being in slavery for that length of time. The United States of America is what, 240 some years old? And imagine that not for 400 years your nation had been in captivity under brutal bondage. And then there was this miraculous event that God rescued you from that and sent you not only on freedom from slavery, but on a journey to a new life. That's a transition, a life transition that you would celebrate. And that's what Israel did every year. And it was a season of change for them that they remembered. And some seasons of transition for us are beautiful in our lives. A new baby, a new job, maybe you buy a new home, you start a new career. A number of life transitions don't cause us to grieve. They cause us a lot of joy. And the Passover was one of those events that people participated in because it brought them joy. And so Jesus, again, as I said, his own parents would go on this trip every year. Well, as they're walking along, we get to verse 15. While they were talking and discussing these things with one another, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. And he said, "Surprise, it's me!" No, that's not what he said. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know these things that have happened here in these days? Haven't you been on Facebook? Dude, it's all over the place. Everybody's tweeting about this." And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some of the women in our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels, right? Because they said it was nonsense, right? And who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. This is the meat of the message that I want to talk about today. The way that these individuals are wrestling with and handling the loss of Jesus in their lives and the way that Jesus encounters them. So there's two kind of key phrases that stood out to me that kind of I understood immediately when I read them, all right? And the first one is in verse 21 that I want to talk about. And it's this little phrase when Jesus says, what's going on, and they're explaining to him what happened, and then they say this thing. We had hoped, but we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. We had hoped. And we all could fill in that with something in our life. But we had hoped. I had hoped I would be in a different place in my life at this point. I had hoped I would have a better GPA. I had hoped I would have a better job. I had hoped, that my marriage would have made it. I had hoped. But we could fill that in with all kinds of losses in our own life. It might be the loss of a physical ability as we age, and our bodies don't keep up with us as we want them to. It might be the loss of somebody that we love. It could be the loss of a job. It could even just be the loss of a dream. For years, you stood in the place where you were because you always thought, someday I'm going to do this other thing. And then finally, you come to realize that you've never actually done that thing that you wanted to do. And you kind of died at that, and it hurts deeply. We had hoped, they said, that Jesus was going to be the Redeemer. And it's beautiful because he is. They don't realize it at this point, right? They went into Jerusalem thinking one thing about Jesus. They went in thinking that he was a prophet, as they mentioned. He's a great teacher. He does great miracles. And next on the list is he's going to be our king. He's gonna form a coup, overthrow Rome, and Israel will be its own nation again. It's gonna be good old days all over again. And that's what we entered Jerusalem thinking that, but that's not what happened at all. In fact, we don't even know where his body is. His dead body is gone. We can't even mourn him properly. I think it's just some interesting symmetry here with Jesus' own parents, 21 years earlier. 3 days later, can't find Jesus. Where is he? They think they've lost him. And for many of us, maybe even 21 years later, we are still saying, oh, we had hoped things would be different. It's interesting to me that Jesus lets them speak. I joked with you earlier that Jesus shows up and says, boo, it's me, right? That's not what he does. He lets them not know he's there so that they can name their losses. I think that's important. If we ever want to move on from the losses in our lives and experience redemption and the grace of God, we have to be willing to name them before Jesus. We've got to be brave enough to say out loud to him the things that we're disappointed in. We might even be able to say, Jesus, I'm disappointed in you because I wanted this thing and you didn't let it happen to me yet. I'm angry about it. I'm confused, disillusioned. In fact, verse 17 was the other phrase that stood out to me in this text. In verse 17, Jesus approaches them and he says, what are you talking about? And the very last part of that verse says, they stood still looking sad. They just stopped their walk to Emmaus. They turned to him, and grief was just written all over their faces. Because losses in our lives are disorienting, they're confusing. Sometimes we don't even know what to say. We just want to stand still and look sad. They stood still and they looked sad. What we don't realize in these moments, when we believe our hopes are lost and our dreams are disrupted, that Jesus himself is standing there beside them and beside us. So in the moment of their greatest loss, as they stand still and name their losses to Jesus, they don't even realize that he's there. There's something beautiful and mysterious about that. But the same thing is true for us. In the middle of our losses, when we feel alone, we're not alone. We have a risen Christ beside us. Sometimes our loss blinds us to the reality of Jesus' presence. Sometimes we're so grieved over what we've lost that we forget and we can't even see the proximity of Jesus to us. Again, if I'm Jesus, I show up and I'm just like slapping him on the back and I'm saying, it's me, guys, let's party. But Jesus is wise, and Jesus knows that he needs to correct some misunderstandings first. When they said we thought he would be the Redeemer, they still aren't understanding that he is the Redeemer, but not in the way that they thought that he was going to be. The desire isn't wrong. They're just confused about what it looks like. And so, we read the final part of this, or moving in on the final part, verses 25 and 27. Jesus said to them, O foolish ones, and slow to heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he interpreted to them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. So Jesus uses these 7 miles to not necessarily reveal to them who he is yet, but just to correct some misunderstandings that they have about him. He had to kind of get in there and help them to reorient themselves towards Christ. And what's beautiful here is in that verse, he says, didn't you know it is necessary that the Christ should suffer these things? That's the same word that Jesus used with his own parents 21 years earlier when they found him in the temple. And he said, guys, didn't you know it's necessary for me to be in my Father's house? You think you've lost me, but I'm discovering my calling. You think, guys, this couple believed that they had lost Jesus, but really it was the fulfillment of a new era for them. I'm discovering my purpose. I'm living it out so that I can enter my glory. What we often think of as a disappointment in our life is actually a new beginnings with Christ. Ron Walborn is the dean of our theological school in the Alliance, and recently he said this. I thought this spoke to me. He says, fresh vision always gives birth in the midst of disappointment and loss. Grieve well and look for a new revelation. God always redeems our pain. So I don't know what your loss is and your pain. Maybe you've been hanging on to that for a really long time. What this story tells me is that Jesus is present in that pain. That Jesus gives us time and space to speak that hurt to him. And then he helps us gently to reorient ourselves towards the realities of a new beginning that only he can bring. When we experience our own loss, it's an opportunity to encounter the resurrected Christ in a new way. The glorified Christ is what we celebrate at Easter. Well, finishing up the text here. So they drew near to the village to which they were going, and he acted as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is towards evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. And while he was at table with them, he took bread, and he blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. We're going to do that in a little bit when we have communion. We're going to take bread, we're going to bless it, we're going to hand it out. And something in that moment, suddenly their eyes were open. What does it say? And their eyes were open, and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road? While he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose at that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and has appeared to Simon." And they told what had happened to them on the road, and how he was known to them in the breaking of bread. I love that phrase. After Jesus reveals himself and then just pulls his disappearing act, they said, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" What a transformation. 7 miles earlier, they're grieving. They're standing still, looking sad. By the end of it, their hearts are on fire as they understand a new reality and the purpose of God in their life. In Jesus' case, with his parents 21 years earlier, after he explains to them his calling as a 12-year-old, it says a fascinating statement on his mother's part. It says that Mary treasured up all of these things and pondered them in her heart. What a transformation for her. From anxiety and disappointment at the loss of her son to all of a sudden this beautiful reality of who he was. These disciples literally make a 100-degree turn and go back to Jerusalem to encounter Jesus in a new way. You know what they do? They start a church. The disciples begin a church, and which we carry on to this day. It's why we're here on Easter Sunday celebrating. It's because Jesus resurrected. He transformed that loss into something beautiful and gave us a new purpose. So does the message of resurrection, it brings hope to our disappointment. Jesus can redeem your loss as well. Maybe your heart is burning within you this morning. Maybe you recognize that you're going in the wrong direction. You're going to Emmaus, but you shouldn't be. You should be going back to Jerusalem to encounter Jesus, to get a call on your life. Maybe you've never decided to follow Jesus, and you want to do that today. You've never become his disciple like these two were. I would encourage you to simply surrender your life to Jesus. If some of you got a connection card as you came in, that's not just for visitors. We'd love for you to fill that out if you're a first-time visitor here. But also, if you want to make a decision to follow Jesus today, we want to partner with you in that and help you become a good disciple, to walk with him. And so if you want to just jot that down on the back and drop it in the basket on the way out, we would love to walk with you in that. Today, I'm going to have the worship team come on up. But as we celebrate communion, as we break bread together, my hope is that it becomes one of those moments when our own eyes are open, that we can process our loss in a way that helps us to remember the resurrected Christ, that he can redeem that loss, and that he brings new hope to that. So as these elements are being handed out, I encourage you just to hold on to the bread and the cup so everybody has been served, and then we'll eat and drink together as well. How about I pray for us as the music, as the worship team gets ready. Lord Jesus, Holy Spirit, we ask that you would come into this presence, into our presence today. That you would minister, that you would heal broken hearts. That you would take discouragement and disillusionment and transform it into hope and anticipation for the future. That you would help us to embrace the resurrected Jesus in a way that we've never done before. We believe in the power of the gospel. Help us to walk in that victory. In Jesus' name, amen.